Chapter 22. Ecocriticism offers a word from our sponsor. In this chapter, we'll cover ecocriticism as activist literary criticism, beyond anthropomorphism, the construction and control of landscapes, Native American perspectives, and theoretical exchanges. Read locally, think globally, really globally. Not just about the people in the world, but all the living things in the world and all the elements necessary to keep them alive. That's what ecocritics want you to have in mind whenever you read, and they mean it. Hit the ground running. Ecocriticism, which blends ecological awareness and activism with literary theory and criticism, also raises the question, but what does literature really have to do with the environment, except for maybe all those trees that get turned into books or the energy needed to power my e-reader? Ecocritics begin by arguing that in the context of the ongoing global environmental crisis, everything you do has some effect, good or bad, on the situation. Cultural attitudes and literary representations serve either to perpetuate the behavior that damages the Earth's ecosystem, or to help change the direction of exploitative and dangerous activities. And yes, especially if you're a cyborg, see Chapter 19, you'll need to work out your relationship to the environment. As we've seen throughout this book, literary theory has been instrumental in calling attention to issues of power, inequality, and oppression. Ecocritics raise awareness of these issues as they bear on the most comprehensive relationship of all, that between human beings and the world we live in. As Cheryl Glotfelty, one of the key figures in ecocriticism, has explained, literature is connected to the world in ways that go beyond discussing the world of merely human society. According to Glotfelty, literature plays a part in an immensely complex global system in which energy, matter, and ideas interact. The approach that ecocriticism takes also helps illuminate the reciprocal relationship that always exists between theory and criticism. Glotfelty has noted that as theory, ecocriticism negotiates between the human and the non-human, which means trying to discover previously unknown or ignored principles that unite humans with other aspects of the natural world. On the other hand, ecocriticism's critical stance has one foot in literature and the other on land. This indicates the position ecocritics take when they read, a position that requires close reading of texts as well as an intimate understanding of nature. Ecocritical theory, therefore, as it uncovers new ways of seeing relationships in the natural world, leads to new ways of reading, and vice versa. Ecocriticism's critical reading of both text and nature helps enable new theories. Another founding critic of the field, Lawrence Buell, rhymes with mule, has explained that ecocriticism is not a unified movement or critical school, but instead, like feminism's multiple perspectives, ecocriticism gathers itself around a commitment to environmentality from whatever critical vantage point. Ecocritics are driven by issues and questions, rather than guided by a single method or paradigm. What kind of questions? As we'll see, the questions range from asking about themes to looking deeply into literary form and even scientific and theological issues. Some questions you can ask right away of anything you're currently reading. How does this literary work represent nature? How do its metaphors and symbolism suggest an opinion about the land? Does the work seem to value the human world over the natural world? Or does the work seem to subvert the valorization of technology? In Chapter 2, you'll recall that critics want you to see natural imagery as more than mere scenery. In Frankenstein, for example, any given description of nature typically reflects a character's personality or even an important theme in the novel. Ecocritics suggest you also consider how Shelley's descriptions of European nature contribute to the novel's environmental orientation. Some critics have pointed out in particular that Victor's journey from Switzerland to Ireland is filled with travelogue-like passages emphasizing the interplay between uninhabited nature and the towns that define human history. While any work can be interpreted with regard to ecological issues and the questions mentioned earlier, Buell has suggested that works with a specifically environmental orientation, what is sometimes called green literature, will include the following qualities. Nature is not just background for the work, but an active presence, illustrating the necessary interaction between the human and the non-human. The work is not exclusively focused on human interests and fates. Humans should be shown as accountable to the environment. Nature should be seen as a process, not simply as a static or timeless element in the world. As you can tell from the suggestions of what to look for in literature, ecocriticism is a form of critical advocacy. Like so many of the critics represented in this book who feel that the point of understanding the world is to change it, eco-critics actively look for ways to contribute to the health of the planet. Ecocriticism can range, therefore, from environmental concerns focused on how the world can be made a better place for humans, to the complete abandonment of the anthropomorphism of seeing humans as the center of the ecosystem. In the case of deep ecology, what matters most is the health of the entire ecosystem, regardless of what happens to humans. The Earth, according to some critics, should be considered Gaia, an organism unto itself, with regulating processes geared toward its own survival, no matter who lives in it or on it. When humans or any of the other inhabitants provoke an unacceptable level of imbalance, they are eliminated from the system. But hang on, we're still here, at least for now. And keeping in mind that the word ecology itself comes from the Greek word oikos, or house, let's consider how several foundational texts have helped define ecocriticism's approach to keeping our house in order. Coming from the scientific side of things, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring alerted people in 1962 to the dangers of pesticides and air pollution. Carson's book was an instant popular success and helped to initiate the modern environmental movement in the United States and abroad. In literary criticism, Leo Marx's The Machine in the Garden, Technology and the Pastoral Ideal in America, 1964, explored the inherent tension between America's love affair with the myths of the pastoral or natural world and ever-increasing industrialization. Similarly, in The Country and the City, 1973, the British cultural critic Raymond Williams, see Chapter 19, examined how nature is transformed by human commerce and culture, often operating as a mythical counterpart to the modern psyche. Both the United States and Britain, of course, already had a long history of exploring environmental issues in and through literature. It's writing, naturally. According to some eco-critics, the first instance of nature writing in the Western tradition, and one that actually set a bad precedent, was the statement in the Bible that man was to have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and all over the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. Other early examples include ancient Greek pastoral poems, which sang the praises of nature, and Renaissance poetry and drama, which often contrasted busy city life with the repose and magical quality of the country, such as in Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream. Eco-critics, however, have generally pointed to the 19th century traditions in the United States and Great Britain for the most influential examples of writing that really take nature seriously. Such writing offers detailed descriptions of the environment, particularly as it appeared to the author and affected the author's life. In this regard, the American Transcendentalist movement is significant. Transcendentalists such as Ralph Waldo Emerson, 1803 to 1882, Margaret Fuller, 1810 to 1850, and Henry David Thoreau, 1817 to 1862, saw nature and humanity as inherently good, and there was no need for organized religion or moral institutions to lead people to live better lives. All you need, according to the Transcendentalists, is self-reliance, optimism, and a heightened sense of natural details. For Emerson, the human mind was naturally inclined to the divine, if only you could live simply and clearly in sympathy with the natural forces that surround you. See this divinity of daisies around us. Can we not be level to them? What need is there of miracles? Writing and thinking should therefore be organic extensions of nature and not dictated by strict forms. writers should write so that their minds ensure an order of expression, which is the order of nature itself. Perhaps the most prominent work of nature writing for early ecocriticism was Thoreau's Walden, or Life in the Woods, 1854. In this book, Thoreau recorded his 2-year stay in a tiny hut near Walden Pond in Massachusetts. The book describes details of the surrounding environment, as well as Thoreau's own activities as he kept up his simple housekeeping. And while Thoreau stayed at Walden Pond in order to experience the kind of primal immediacy that Emerson advocated, all you aspiring nature writers should take note that Thoreau spent 5 years writing and revising the story of his 2-year experiment. As the editors of the Harper single-volume American Literature have wryly put it, with extreme consciousness of effort, Thoreau mastered a language of spontaneity. However it was achieved, Thoreau's effective prose has continued to inspire. Buell, for example, explained that Thoreau's nature writing keeps environmental perceptiveness activated by shuttling back and forth between reporting what sound like objective facts and throwing in whimsical twists that defamiliarize those facts, such as describing muskrats as people and people as muskrats. In Britain, as we've seen in Chapter 8, the Romantic poet critics spent a lot of time and ink exploring nature and its importance to human beings. The British critic Jonathan Bate has pointed out, however, that literary criticism has often overlooked or downplayed the actual environmental emphasis of the Romantics' writing. Critics, according to Bate, have rushed to transform the natural images of poetry by Wordsworth, Coleridge, and Keats into metaphors for everything except nature. For example, Bates argued that while Marxist critics have viewed the personification of nature in Wordsworth's Prelude as a device for talking about politics, Bates sees nature in Wordsworth's poem representing, well, nature. Eco-critics have generally pointed out, in fact, how often nature is seen only as a metaphor for something else in literature. Walden, for example, has been read as a political critique, and Mark Twain's Mississippi River has been interpreted politically as well. Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter and Young Goodman Brown prominently feature images of the forest, yet critics tend to focus only on the allegorical significance of the forest as a place to face your demons rather than, as the eco-critics would prefer, exploring the forest imagery in greater and more literal detail. On the other hand, as Buell has argued, the natural settings of some literary works manage to bring nature to you as an active force, and with an ecologically responsible sense of the reciprocal relationship between the human and the non-human. In Thomas Hardy's Return of the Native, 1878, for example, Buell says the famous setting of Egdon Heath is given an aboriginal personhood that clearly acts as a potent force in the novel, influencing character development and not simply serving as background. Nevertheless, Buell has noted that despite the active role given to nature in the novel, Hardy barely scratched the surface when it came to really discussing the setting's actual ecosystem, which, while fictional in name, was based on an actual place. Portrait of the Land as a Young Woman. Speaking of settings, just check out that landscape. Which one? Just look anywhere, because what you'll see is a landscape, if that's what you're looking for. According to eco-criticism, nature is nature, but a landscape, like a weed, is really in the eye of the beholder. As Alison Byerly has explained, Western civilization has a long tradition of turning natural entities into aesthetic objects for consumption. The picturesque movement in the late 18th century European art, for example, featured carefully balanced compositions of natural scenes, and tourists would even travel, long before cameras, with curved, tinted mirrors that produced the proper look of a natural scene in a single shot. Recalling Raymond Williams, see Chapter 19, Byerly explained that while nature has been exploited for its material resources, it's also been exploited for its aesthetic value and treated as a commodity, such as treating the Grand Canyon as art and exploiting it as a tourist destination. Regarding the U.S. National Park Service in general, Byerly argued that the aestheticization of landscape permits the viewer to define and control the scene, yet fosters the illusion that the scene is part of self-regulating nature. Blending eco-criticism with feminist approaches, ecofeminists have argued that one of the most prevalent of all metaphors that transform the natural environment into an object for observation, consumption, and control is the idea of the wilderness as a refuge for men. In wilderness romances, for example, it's the men, or even more often, the adolescent boys, who must strike out into the wilderness in order to prove themselves and escape the feminizing influence of civilization. Think of Twain's The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, James Fenimore Cooper's Leatherstocking Tales, or Melville's Moby Dick. Meanwhile, argue ecofeminists, another metaphor has been just as prominent, which is the view that mastering nature means mastering women. Judith Federle, see Chapter 12, has argued that the American wilderness is often depicted as a female to be tamed. From this perspective, it's culture and rational masculinist knowledge that prevails over nature's irrational femininity. And as the eco-critic William Hogworth has written, the dogma that culture will always master nature has long directed Western progress. Critic Annette Kolodny went even further by highlighting the sexual subtext for much male-authored American literature. Her 1975 book, The Lay of the Land, yes, the pun is intended, explores how images of American domination, exploitation, and control are gendered. In her work, Kolodny also refers to the influential Eros and Civilization, 1955, written by Herbert Marcuse, one of the key members of the Frankfurt School. See Chapter 19. Eco-critic Vera L. Norwood has summarized Kolodny's views, as well as those of historian Richard Slotkin, by explaining that masculine culture in America characteristically sees wilderness as a place for defining virility, for playing out aggressive, adventure-seeking, sometimes violent impulses, and in fact, women were thought to be more comfortable in rural, cultivated nature, in civilized gardens. Norwood has also pointed out, however, that women writers such as Isabella Bird, Mary Austin, Rachel Carson, and Annie Dillard complicate the equation by showing how women have acted as heroines in preserving the natural environment so central to American culture. Varieties of eco-critical experience. Appropriately enough, one set of questions that eco-critics consider involves their relationship with other approaches in the environment of literary theory itself. The Canadian eco-critic Anne Milne has explained that contemporary theory, despite its emphasis on the textuality of all experience, is not entirely at odds with eco-criticism's insistence on the real. Specifically, theory's critical view of master narratives, binary oppositions, and other skeptical approaches to the human construction of reality speak directly to social constructions of nature as well. By investigating what Milne calls the ecological imagination, eco-criticism invites collaboration with new historicism, cultural studies, ethnic studies, psychoanalysis, deconstruction, and post-coloniality. Seeing, but not seen. Since its inception, eco-criticism has been significantly influenced by Native American studies. Take the issue of landscapes as just one example of productive comparative critique. The Native American writer Leslie Marmon Silko has shown, in fiction as well as criticism, that for Native American culture, there exists no break between the land and any inhabitant of that land. The European idea of standing back to observe a landscape, and, as we've seen, the impulse to take ownership of and control that landscape, simply does not follow from a Native American approach to the land. According to this view, observer and observed fuse together when you understand the true nature of reality. In addition, the symbolic value of woman as land is disrupted by a Native American ecology as well. In an essay appearing in a volume pointedly titled "The Desert is No Lady," Patricia Clark Smith, 1943 to 2010, and Paula Gunn Allen, 1939 to 2008, have explained that for natives, the land encompasses butterfly and ant, man and woman, adobe wall and gourd vine, trout beneath the river water, rattler deep in his winter den. And all of this is beyond human domination. Women, therefore, are viewed as an affirming part of nature, not an image of nature available for appropriation and manipulation. Collective energies. The critic, William Reichert, the guy responsible, in fact, for coining the term ecocriticism in 1978, vigorously advocated seeing poetry and all literature as a source of power. Literary works, according to Reichert, are like renewable fossil fuels, since they release stored energy and yet never become depleted. Reichert's own recommendations for getting the most out of this literary energy include checking out the poetry of Adrian Rich's Diving into the Wreck, W.S. Merwin's The Lice, and Walt Whitman's Song of Myself, as well as the prose of William Faulkner's Absalom, Absalom, and of course, Thoreau's Walden. Other eco-critics who have explored theoretical intersections include Sue Ellen Campbell, who linked post-structuralism with eco-criticism by showing how both approaches see identity only in relations. Hard to get away from Saussure, isn't it? See Chapter 11 for more. Campbell has also linked eco-criticism with the Lacanian principle of fundamental loss as the basis of desire. See Chapter 18. Since ecologists also see experience of lost unity and a desire to regain it as central to our human nature. Michael J. McDowell has argued that Bakhtin's theories, see Chapter 20, reflect to many of the central concerns of eco-criticism. For example, the multi-voiced and dialectic form of literature that Bakhtin valued seems perfectly suited for the eco-critic's view of a world in which no single species dominates. McDowell has also explained how Bakhtin's notion of the chronotope, see Chapter 20 again, offers a valuable theoretical tool for analyzing the essential unity of time and place in nature writing. You can have your chronotopes of rooms and SUVs and the specific atmospheres they create. Eco-critics will run with the chronotope of the river, the hill, the tree limb, or that spot at the end of the leaf where a butterfly stands, looking, I might say, like a tiny open book. The least you need to know. Eco-criticism advocates reading as a means of raising your consciousness of the global environmental crisis. Nature writing has a long history of exploring the relationship between the human and the non-human. A landscape is an aesthetic creation of the human observer. Nature and images of the wilderness have been associated with femininity in negative as well as positive ways. Native American perspectives on the natural world emphasize symbiosis and unity rather than separation and dominance. Eco-critical interpretations of literature can incorporate a wide variety of critical approaches and literary theories.